one of the things about the neighborhood that I recently read a book uh, about the neighborhood by a writer of some esteem, and he put a few negative things. Sometimes these writers, they consider themselves so hip they think they're making a compliment, but it really came off pretty backhanded. He said something about the Italian element of the neighborhood, and I really think, kind of like that they might have been a little lowbrow or not as cultured as, I guess, some NYU graduates or whoever it is that's around here. But that's really what kept the neighborhood together.
Yeah, really.
I mean, all these years, you're starting to see it now. We're here in 2015, and I do a bit of real estate myself too. And you're here in 2015, and those people are leaving and they're moving, and I don't think that the new people are going to like what's going to replace those people. It's going to be a lot of overpriced apartments and hard to get into real estate, and I think that element is gone. And another thing about it is it's a totally organic thing, kind of the Italian American community around here. I met a guy works at Cartwright and Doubleday. It's a big design firm in the neighborhood, and he was talking to me, and he was asking me where I was from, and I was explaining it to how I am, and I was like, well, my parents are from. He said, well, where are your parents from? And he's like, was it the Italian section? And I was like, I've been here 30 years. I don't know where the Italian section is.
Yeah.
I said, Metropolitan
Somewhere,
Avenue
yeah.
and Lomer Street. I don't know if you consider that the Italian section of what it is, but I just think that was a big part of what made the community great. This side of the neighborhood especially, I don't think the other sides kind of got as integrated as fast as this side did.
Well, they certainly held the line.
Yeah, they held the
I
line.
mean, I do. Funny, I had to really go to Bayville on Long Island to realize that people sometimes look disparagingly on Italians. My uncle used to rent a house out there every summer. It was a big old house, and I had a bunch of cousins, and we would stay out there. And I remember I was coming back to the beach with Bobby and Richie, my cousins, who have since departed. And we're just doing kid stuff like snapping towels at one another and this guy, old timer, sitting on the porch, and he jumps up and he's shouting at us, and his wife comes out and said, what's going on? She said, well, it's those guinea kids from down the block. So we thought that was funny because we thought we were Americans, we didn't think so, but it did start my wheels turning, it did start my wheels turning about it. And I realized too that I really did grow up. I mean, I didn't think so at the time, but I did grow up in this Italian-American atmosphere, for better or worse, okay, for better or worse.
We never really looked at it like that. It was just,
well,
I don't think we ever,
well, there were some things about it.
People come from far away, and they ask what's around here, and who's around here, and that's how that kind of came. It was just always the neighborhood as it was.
Well, you're talking about a little different than the neighborhood I grew up in.
Yeah, no, you're right.
I mean, the neighborhood I grew up in, it was possible to walk around for a while and not hear English spoken.
True.
There used to be a lot of little cafes.
There's still people around here that my dad always says English is kicking their ass. He always says.
My grandfather had it, and my grandfather, I might as well talk about him. He came here probably about 1899 or so. He lived on Mulberry Street or in Little Italy, and I guess when they opened the Williamsburg Bridge, he walked over the bridge looking for work, and he did get work in a building that is now a condo on Kent Avenue, where the restaurant La Nonna is on the ground floor. That was a company, and I just saw the plaque there, a company called Austin Nichols, and they were importers of groceries and like barrels of weed and stuff like that. He was a barrel hooper. So that's what brought us to this neighborhood in the early part of the 1900s, And as much as he could read English, he read the American newspaper. He read the Italian newspaper at the time, was El Progresso. And all that, man, it was hard to understand. It was hard to understand them, and probably because there wasn't this. He lived in the neighborhood. He worked in the neighborhood. Probably a lot of guys that worked down there also spoke Italian, so there wasn't this compelling need to speak English. Both of my, I think my father also, both of my aunts were bilingual. You know, they were very adept in and of course, if they wanted to say something that they didn't want us to know, they would say it in Italian. You know, so we would know. Unfortunately, they didn't encourage us to learn, which I think is kind of a drag. I wish I can understand more than I can actually speak. I was in Italy on a music job a few years ago, and I was in Amalfi, and I did okay. You know, I mean, I couldn't say much, but if they spoke to me, I could slow them down, and I could kind of few phrases make myself known. You know, but so I was kind of proud of that. But again, really, the Italians held the line here. You know, and really, in the old days, the way I understand it. The other side of Grand Street was actually Irish. My mother's mother was Irish, and they lived there. Okay, this would be in the late 1890s. Okay, and every time when I read that book or saw the movie A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, it was kind of like my grandmother's time slot, you know. And if you ever read the book, they mention Grand Street, they mention some businesses.
They mention this library.
They mention this library. That's true. That's right. So yeah, that was an Irish section. And even as a young kid, like 13 or so, there were still some Irish kids that lived in the project, although it was predominantly Hispanic and black. But there were still some Irish kids that lived in the project. And the other way, towards the south side, that was a Jewish area, which was a pretty hot area. You know, it was a pretty good area. But that really kind of collapsed in the late 50s and 60s, you know. So
That early, huh?
yeah, I would say. When I say collapse, in other words, the Jewish presence was quickly moving out, you know. They were going, my friend Artie Sakharov, he moved to Sheepshead Bay, and a lot of people moved out east. Moved out east, or even in Brooklyn.
Why don't you talk about the time that you were in here and you heard the music?
Oh, well, I'm a musician, you know, and I like to think myself as a jazz musician. And I was about 13, I guess. And there was a sign up on the wall that there was going to be a lecture about jazz. So at the time, I thought that that would be like talking about Dixieland and New Orleans, and also there was somebody who was going to play some music here. So, I mean, I was into doo-wops and everything else, but I did have this curiosity. My older cousins and even my dad, there were some records around the house, or I didn't know him very well, but there were still some records of what you would call maybe jazz music, you know. So I was curious about it, and I thought it was hip because my older cousins, some of my uncles were into it, and part of the Sunday ritual at my aunt's house would be they would go down to the basement and play George Shearing records, or Stan Kenton, or Dizzy Gillespie, or somebody. So I thought it was cool. So I saw this. I didn't you hear what they had to say? So when I got here, it was downstairs, the place where they did this thing. And there was a bassist of some note by the name of Ahmed Abdul Malik. Contrary to what you might think, he wasn't an American Muslim. He was actually Sudanese. He I don't know if he was born in the Sudan or his parents were born, and that was his name. He was a bass player. He performed most notably with Thelonious Monk, famous record of Thelonious Monk at the 5 spot with John Coltrane. He's the bass player on that. And he came with a bass, and I was impressed with the bass because it was this big dark wood bass. But he also had an instrument which I couldn't identify at the time called an oud. And he eventually made a couple of records of Middle Eastern music as performed in the vernacular of jazz, okay? And I think he had a guitar player with him. And they played some music, and, you know, but I was disappointed because the person who was kind of narrating this said, we're not going to talk about New Orleans and trip up the river. We're going to talk about music that was made in this city, blah, 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 by people like Charlie Parker. That was not the first time I heard that name. And Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk. It was all kind of a mystery to me. Dizzy Gillespie, I think I heard before. So my first exposure to live jazz was actually in this building, you know, in this building here. So what else do I remember about the library? Well, there used to be all these dark wood bookcases around here, you know, and it had that library smell, you know. It had the library smell. And funny thing, man, I always remember this guy. He worked in the library. He was, he must have been like, if he was 20, you know, maybe he was a student doing it part-time, I don't know. But he was an Asian guy, probably Chinese. And what caught my attention about him is he had all the 50s garb on. He had his collar up. He had a real thin belt on, you know. He had his sleeves rolled up. He had a pack of cigarettes in his pocket. He had kind of like a pompadour haircut. And to me, that was real strange because the only Chinese people I ever saw in the neighborhood, there was a guy by the name of Fang Fook who had a laundry over. Everybody he was a funny guy because everybody called him Frank, you know. And he used to like to play cards with all these guys in these social clubs. From what I understand, he was like the world's worst card player. He'd always drop a bunch of money, but he kept going. So here's an interesting story. One time he really hit it big. This might have been in the early 70s. He really took him for a lot of money. So there was some grumbling about this. And maybe somebody was going to do something about it. The guy who was in charge of this neighborhood, if you know what I mean, okay, put a stop to it. He said, listen, when the guy lost, did you give him his money back? Or did you take his money? He won. Leave him alone. So he inadvertently got he was protected because they knew he was going to lose it back anyway. So why give this guy a hard time? He had his day. Let him have his day. So there was that, and then there on Consolidate Street down towards Union Avenue, there was another Chinese laundry. It wasn't. It must have been a commercial laundry. It wasn't open to the public, but there was a Chinese family there, and I remember that there was. How are we talking about Chinese people now? There was a very thin. She was the thinnest girl I ever saw in my life, and they really didn't intermingle with the locals that much. But I remember there was a candy store on Lorimer Street, right next to where we lived, nicknamed Dirty Mary's. But that didn't stop anybody from going in, right? It was more like kind of messy Mary's, you know. Anyway, they had a little fountain in there, and she used to go in there, and they had a big rack of comic books and magazines, like magazines of the stars or something, you know. And she would always buy a magazine like that, and would sit at the counter with having a chocolate soda or something like that. So that was my main exposure to Chinese people, and they were the only two that I can really remember.
That's amazing.
So much. But Frank was a funny guy, and he always had. He did good work, you know. He did press shirts and the whole thing. But he always had some other line going. He wanted to sell you slippers, or he wanted to sell you something. And he was kind of a popular guy. Everybody liked him. There, well, at least on the surface, there was no open animosity. The fact that he wasn't one of us, so to speak, you know. I'm trying to think. What else? Anything else that I missed on this? Another thing one thing I do remember that might be of interest, and maybe people remember. I told you I'm a ponderer. My daughter says you're a ponderer, Dan. First of all, when I was really young, let's say 7, 8, 9 years old, there was plenty of parking. The streets weren't filled with cars. You know, you could just park anywhere. There'd be plenty of room. There was no alternate side of the street parking, and you could play games in the street, stickball, stoop ball, all these games, and kind of go uninterrupted because there wasn't a lot of traffic. Maybe on Larmer Street there was. But I do remember that, like, especially weather like this, once it got dark, the men, the fathers, would be kind of standing outside of the apartments. And inevitably, if a few of them got together, they would start talking about World War II. Not so much about battle stories, but where they were, where they went, how they went there, what they saw when they were there. So, the kids would just sit on the stoop and listen to them talk. So World War II, when I grew up, was less than 10 years over. So, or maybe about 10 years old. Also, there was a lot of Army surplus stores. And then they sold everything, like, canteens, helmets, web belts, all kind of stuff, And some big stuff. There was a guy, Marco, that had a place, and we'd love it. Like, for a couple of cents, for a buck, man, you'd have an army belt and a holster and a hat, an army hat, and you could have a ball with it. But he had this big shortwave radio that he was trying to sell. And this story is two things, is that, he was trying to sell it to some guy, and I said, well, what use would you have for it and everything? And I remember him saying something about, well, you have to register with the government. And I thought that, when I think back on it, the people in general, probably everywhere, had this trust. The government is going to take care of it, well, you have to, if the government finds out you're doing something, they're not going to. So they had this, like, big trust of the government, which probably changed with the assassination of Kennedy and then other baloney, Vietnam and all. But that was part of what the middle class aspect of this neighborhood, government. Nobody was skeptical of the government. Maybe it was an overflow of positive business during the war, but everybody believed in the government. Government will take care of it. The president. Even when Kennedy died, like, it wasn't even that night. And I remember Nana and my Aunt Mary referring to Johnson, the president. Like, there was, like, smooth transition. It wasn't until they shot Oswald that people got skeptical. But, President Johnson, man, that happened so quick, like, it would really spin your head around, to the local people here. And I'm sure everywhere else, So, anything else I should cover here?
I'm curious about one thing. You mentioned the guy who ran the neighborhood. Was that?
Well, I can't say the name.
No, I know you can't name names, but
because
I'm curious. I mean, is that kind of what you would think, kind of how it worked?
Well, it did work that way.
Mm-hmm.
But probably not in the way that
it was. It's a different thing than what. It's definitely a different thing.
There's
than
a
what it is
Hollywood
today.
mechanism.
Yeah.
There's a Hollywood mechanism. There's a. Everything is embellished on television.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? It was a different type of a thing. It wasn't like
it was.
It wasn't like these people were using scare tactics to, like, bother citizens. It was
The closest that I could explain of what went on Lorimer Street between Metropolitan and Conslayer is, if you ever see A Bronx Tale, there was a guy that ran things. Okay? Now, if everything they say is true, this was a hotbed of illegal gambling. Williamsburg was.
easily.
All kind of gambling.
Still today.
Okay. Next to that, probably extortion. I'm talking about this like it's not, well, a little extortion, a little something,
the statute of limitations. Expired.
So
on this
anyway, that person in those days, the people who were under them or protected by them, they owed a certain responsibility to. Okay, to straighten things out. Okay. And I mean, if I'm not a historian, but if you go back and you look at the Naples area, which most people are from around here who were, or Sicily, you learn that those two regions were under the control of just about everybody. The Turks ran it, the Spaniards ran it, the French ran it, the Portuguese ran it. Even Sweden had control of Sicily. So there was like this kind of, listen, leave those out of it, we'll take care of our own business. So, of course, it really did develop into, I mean, it was never a great thing, don't get me wrong, okay? And there was a lot of stuff that went on, but there was a social order that those people who were in charge were expected to maintain. And if there was something going on that was getting attention from somewhere else, then they weren't doing their job. You know, I mean, so it's little things like that. Yeah, that was the person who ran. And there were, not to get into this, okay, but there were several factions in this neighborhood that kind of were side by side. You know,
They all coexisted.
different. I would say 3 of the 5 families, as they were called, existed here, shoulder to shoulder, with not any really. I mean, I don't know everything about it, you know, and I do remember my mother's story. You know where the steakhouse is on Larimer Street, on Leonard Street there? Across street there's a new apartment building, new big building. Well, that was a vacant lot for many years. My mother told me that it was the site of a dance hall. It was like, this was a German area before it was Italian. And it was like kind of like a German beer hall that they used to have dances and stuff. And I remember my aunt and my mother talking about an incident probably in the 1920s or early 30s where there was a dance going on there, and some guys came in and took a couple of guys out. And the next day they were, you know, assassinated somewhere. So, yeah, I'm sure there was stuff like that. We're talking about a long time ago, too. And she also told me that once a year, Cab Calloway and his band would come to that corner in that dance hall and play a dance for one of there was a lot of social clubs around here, which were really basically guys playing cards and gambling and stuff like that. But there were a lot of social clubs around here. So I'm not an apologist for that, okay? Because being a musician, I have been around it, okay? And it's not always pleasant, okay? Romanticizing it, that's one thing. And even as my uncle, who was somewhat involved, would say, everybody's good unless they owe you money.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the guy's terrific. You don't owe him any money. Owe him money or be involved with him, and it'll be a different story. So they had this one face to the public, and then another dynamic went on among the people who were involved with it.
And I think that it's safe to say that the people who were the constituents of these type of people, I guess you would call them, they had a similar faith in them as they did the government in that time. There was somebody kind of taking care of things and watching over things, I guess, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah, you know.
They
I mean, you know, somebody's getting, like the famous scene in The Godfather 2 where the woman goes to the Godfather's wife and says, my landlord's throwing me out of the house. Well, why? You know. That was something that they might handle. So,
That would have been a type of a situation.
I'll pay, you know, she's alone, blah, blah, blah. You know, that was the kind of thing, you know, benevolence that existed with those kind of guys then. Again, you know, another one of my stories. So I used to work in a nightclub in Bay Ridge. And it was frequented by a lot of these kind of guys. And I knew who they were. So I remember it was like the end of the job. I was walking. There was a supermarket that had a big parking lot where most people that went into this club at night would park their cars in. And my car was in there as well. And I'm walking through, and I see 2 of these guys snorting coke. So I said, wow, man, what's wrong with this picture? That's so-and-so and so-and-so. Man, I never knew, you know, anything. Those guys maintained this thing about hands off because they didn't trust it. They didn't trust it was a sign. I mean, maybe they sold it, I don't know. I don't think that was the issue here so much. But if you were involved, then you were weak, and you could be a weak link. So when I saw these guys doing it, I said, wow, it didn't seem like that. There's something wrong with this picture. Those guys don't do this. But as you saw in the movie, what was it, Goodfellas? That's really what brought them down, man. They were all, you know, they were all doing coke, and that's that
That's
kind of
one thing about the mafia that doesn't get really portrayed maybe in movies too much, is that they make it out like these guys are like, you know, evil knights in armor kind of going around the street, Teflon and all that. Really, a lot of them are junkies themselves, or they're low-level henchmen that...
Back now,
even
but back,
today and then...
back then it was a little different. It was a little different. They maintain, they kind of maintain
but they,
a low profile for sure. You know.
With that.
They really, with everything, really, you know. You never really, very rarely did those guys flaunt anything. Like, you didn't say Genovese used to just wear a simple suit and a shirt without a tie and stuff like that. You know, the mentality was you don't want to send up any flares here. I kind of hate that we're talking about this because we always wind up talking about it. But, you know, again, I'm not an apologist for it, you know, in any sense. And it irks me sometimes that even Italian people, that's all they ever talk about, you know, about when they talk about our culture, they talk about that. Come on, man, there's more to it than that, you know.
Oh, yeah.
There's more to it than that. So
nobody ever brings up Michelangelo or
Da
Vinci or anything. They always,
you know,
somehow Tony Soprano is always kind of like, has always kind of overshadowed, or Marconi, who invented the radio.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I mean? It's just like, yeah, you know. I
Well,
guess
so
if you're
there
not
was-
Thomas Edison.
There was a show on Channel 13 some time ago, and they discussed that. They discussed the fact that there were for every you know person that gets this notoriety for being a gangster, they're overlooking so many other people, you know. And really, which I hope that this doesn't sound too militant, but one of the points of the show was, well, the Italian people are a minority without third world protection. So it's kind of open season. You know, you can say anything you want about Italian. Oh, they're dishonest, they're this, they're that. Oh, yeah, you're the mafia, yeah.
It's really
So
true. If you really
kinda
think about
true,
it.
you know. You wouldn't get away with talking about somebody Jewish like that.
No way.
And rightly so, because there's a whole history of genocide and what have you. Of course, you wouldn't get away with, although blacks talk about themselves in very derogatory ways too.
Sometimes.
You know, they don't really hold up the best of that group either sometimes. And so anyway, I feel sometimes it's open season on Italians.
I think the contribution, especially around here, you have so many people coming from so many different places, and all they really have is Tony Soprano, or all they really have are those images in Goodfellas. And I don't think, you know, I mean, if I had $1 for every time some kind of out-of-towner asked me if their landlord was in the mafia or something like that, I'd be a very rich guy. I could afford a house around here to buy it.
Well, I might as well get on my Frank Sinatra thing, because we do have Frank Sinatra, okay? And everybody holds up Frank Sinatra. However, they generally hold him up for the wrong reasons. They talk about him as a confidant of mafiosos. They talk about him, a guy who romanced every woman and you know, in Hollywood. They don't really talk about the music. They don't really talk about some other things. There was a special. There's a great book which he's read and I read by Pete Hamill. It's called Why Sinatra Matters. And at the end of the book, and they had the special on, a couple of HBO specials.
There's obviously the new Alex Gibney documentary, but that was very general, you know.
Yeah, but at the end, he kind of says the last page or so of the book, and he said, listen, he says, I really like this guy. He enriched me with his music all these years. He confronted bigotry head on when it wasn't popular to do it. And he's changed the way people thought about immigrants, you know. And so, I mean, that's what we should be proud of him for.
To a degree, I mean, I tell you one thing that that directly relates to the neighborhood that I don't know how I feel about it as much anymore. You know, when I was a kid, we always grew up with the feast at Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the Fest of San Pelino, and I don't know if I guess it was just that I was a kid or but it was a very, very special thing, and it was a very, very special thing in a time when there weren't that many visitors to Williamsburg, and that a lot of people weren't here for the touristy reasons, and I'm very grateful to the people around here, you know, Nucci, Panolino, and Philip Franco,
Because they keep it going.
and these people,
Joe
Peluso, that these people have kept it going. For literally, it's almost 130 years straight that this thing has been done, give or take, and there's some speculation
I don't
about.
think they did it during
There's some
World War II.
speculation about if it actually did go on during World War II. But one of the things that kind of made me sad, and I guess it was bound to happen, is that the influx, and I don't know if it's this cut and dry, but I think the influx of the people that came here, to them it just kind of seemed like the Mafia Bazaar.
Well,
And, you know,
I don't think that's right. And
I
I'll tell
think
you why.
I think that there's still, it's still very special when they raise the statue and they lift the statue. That's
It
really
is
for the
special.
people that are around
And
here.
as hip as I am sometimes, well, I think I am.
We always say
excuse me,
this.
as hip as I think I am, and I play music all over the world. I've been to London, and I played with musicians who I only heard about when I was a young guy. When they play that stupid song, I get a lump in my throat.
There's something very beautiful about it. You
Well,
know,
what I want to say about that is this: when I was a young kid, that was it. You know, I mean, that was every summer. You couldn't wait for it to happen. I remember walking around there with my grandfather before the school was built. Then, when I got older, it was a teenage thing. Everybody be at the feast every night. Then, I kind of feel like he feels about it now. What is it? Then, when they were born, and I started taking them around, I started seeing it again through their eyes. So what I come away from, it's a long tradition. It's from, if you don't know, you probably don't know, it's from people who came from Nola, which is a city in Italy. An incident took place over 1,000 years ago where pirates from North Africa, Moroccan pirates, somebody, raided the city. And they took all the wheat. And they took slaves. And St. Paulinus was the bishop of Nola. And he offered himself as a hostage if they would bring the slaves back. And you'll see you see the pageantry, okay? Somebody from the Ottoman Empire, a Turk, heard about this and went and raided the pirates and brought the wheat and the slaves back. So when they came to the town, where the town, the people came with lilies. That's what Giglio means in Italian.
Lily.
And since then, in Nola, they do, they do it for a week or something, and they have smaller structures, and they actually run through the streets with it. So they've been doing it here. They first did it in Upper Manhattan, 117th Street and First Avenue, which at one time was the biggest Italian section in the city, even bigger than Mulberry Street. And they did it there. And then some people who lived there came here. Again, like my grandfather they came here because it was like a country in the early part of the century. And they used to do it there. They've done it here continually. They used to do it in Astoria. Now I heard that, so now it's expanding. They kind of do it. And if you don't know the story, you don't know the background, it just seems like some kind of a wacky thing. But anyway, like I said, everybody goes through their cycle with it. When you're a kid, it's fabulous. Then you get a little too hip for it, and you say, "Oh, what's this?" Then you have your own kids, and you say, "Oh, it's hip again." So
when you grow up, I say people grow up with the feast around here, like most New Yorkers grow up with the Mets and the Yankees. It's a very it parallels that in a lot of ways. It's something consistent. It's something that takes place in a season that's always there. this place changes
Yeah.
a little bit when that happens, and you see a lot of faces that
You didn't see, yeah.
you haven't seen in years. People come out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
You start to see people
From all over.
forget it. One thing I can say that is positive, I mean, I think that there's a small minority of people who do think it's a little hogwashy, I guess, and a little, I don't know, like a little kind of a stupid thing. But there have been a lot of hipsters that
Yeah,
I've seen that
they
have gotten
should.
underneath
I mean,
the thing, that have
you
gotten
know,
underneath the statue and lifted it
People
up.
talk about multiculturalism and celebrating everybody, which I'm a big person on that. I believe that. Why not that? Then again, it comes down to my feelings. It's open season on Italians. You can make fun of any of the thing that they do.
That's part of
So
it.
anyway, so again, I hope I don't sound too militant about that. But I remember when I was really young, maybe about 11, 10, 11, 12 years old, there would be busloads of people that would come here from elsewhere to witness this, and that doesn't exist anymore. But it used to be. It still is Old Home Week in a lot of respects.
If you're
For me, anyway,
if you're
for my
if you're
generation.
there, and they're lifting the larger statue, and the moment is right, it's hard
Yeah,
to
no, it
explain.
does.
It's hard to. I don't even know if you have to grow up in any type of religion. It's obviously has to do with the Roman Catholic
in
thing.
a way,
but
it's aside from the Roman
yeah,
Catholic thing.
in a way, it's more about here now too. I think it's in a way it's more about Williamsburg now than it is even the religion and the story of the bishop. I think it's in a way something that reminds people that this is a special place. Astoria is a nice neighborhood. I lived there for a long time. It doesn't really have what we have here. The people are different. The attitudes are a lot different. They let the neighborhood go years and years ago. I mean, they gave up their big streets to all the chain stores, all the big retailers are in there now. It's not the same thing. And whatever they do, and I consider myself from Queens. Whatever they do in Astoria, or Sunnyside, or Woodside, and they're doing it in Ridgewood now, it's only in an effort to replicate kind of what's here and what's been done here in a lot of ways. That sense of
That's
community.
a real estate guy talking too.
Well, I mean, yeah.
But
not even real estate wise, but I mean, just in the communities alone. I think all these other neighborhoods, what makes Williamsburg so great, and there's this crazy, what makes Williamsburg and Greenpoint so great is that there are all these industrial landscapes that people really like about Brooklyn, and then there's all this great residential on top of it. And what makes Williamsburg and Greenpoint so great, unlike a lot of other parts of the city, is like if you took Greenpoint and Williamsburg and put it together, it would be like its own city, with dozens of music venues, big parks, a big swimming pool. I mean, some cities don't have a couple of those things. You know what I mean? Some places that they consider.
Well, when I was a kid, as I said, my mother's mother was Irish, and some of her sisters, my aunts and uncles, lived in, and my grandmother lived in Ridgewood. Seems like the Irish and the Germans moved to Ridgewood. Ridgewood was a real German area. I mean, really and true. There were German movie theaters, German restaurants, and to a certain extent, and then beyond, maybe beyond Wyckoff Avenue, it was a big Sicilian neighborhood too. So it seems like the Italians were always following the Germans into the neighborhoods.
If you really want to give credit where credit is due around here, as far as preserving Williamsburg and preserving Greenpoint, it's really the Italian Americans in Williamsburg and the Polish people in Greenpoint.
Well, once the Iron Curtain was down, then
I mean, those two groups of people are responsible for so much in this city. You couldn't even imagine it. It was those people that kept Williamsburg good through the bad years. That when the '90s came, and I mean, bands are moving out here. Norah Jones had the biggest song in the country. She was going into Carmine's Pizzeria on Graham Avenue. You know what I mean? It's like, just saying. All that wasn't because people wanted to move here. That was because people kept it nice, and when the time was right, people could move here. It took a lot of other neighborhoods a long time. That's why Bed-Stuy ain't coming back. That's why Fort Green's kind of back. But
well, Bed-Stuy is
wait a
pretty
minute.
hip,
East New York is not coming, but that all happened after Williamsburg.
Yeah, definitely.
Talking about post Williamsburg.
I mean, I went to high school in Bed-Stuy, and it was a middle-class black neighborhood. And then then it got really tough.
You know.
The middle class black people moving into Cambria Heights and moving out again east.
These
So-
neighborhoods were kept good for all this to happen. You understand? It was there wasn't the wrong element here. Larmer and Metropolitan and Union. I mean, there were some junkies like my dad was talking about. It probably wasn't a lot of drug crime or anything like that in the 90s, the late 80s. I mean,
No, not then, but in the 60s.
in the 60s and the 70s, sure. But the
uh,
endurance, all that
village.
endurance was done by the Italian people around here and the Polish people in Greenpoint. They kept it good for the comeback to come. A lot of people abandoned their neighborhoods. If you
Sure.
really look at it, a lot of people went running from Ridgewood and Bushwick and Bed-Stuy and East New York.
Ridgewood held its own.
For a
really.
while, yeah.
Yeah, Bushwick really got burned out, But what else? What else could we say? We kept.
She said the mafia, and we went crazy.
We went on
I
Italian.
think the library's opening now, so we should
Not mafia.
probably wrap it up. But thank you.
No, thank
Yes,
you.
yes, it's a
Thank you. Thank
pleasure
you
to
for
talk
having
to
us.
you. We hope we were helpful.